I'm here with Diogenes of Orem. How are you doing, Diogenes?
I am good. How are you? Just DLA? Is that the best thing to call you?
I always stick with the deep left. We gotta
Deep
keep
left.
pushing that. We gotta stop. People gotta stop calling me a left mold buggian, left Yarvin, whatever, neocon. I'm okay with neoliberal, but neocon, it's like, come on, let's use my preferred pronouns. But yeah,
Deep left. All right.
that's my crusade. I don't know. It's funny, like the labels and the names, like you have to be called something, and
Yes.
I chose this, and now I'm stuck with it. So I'm in a sunk cost fallacy. I'm digging my own hole here with this
Yeah.
commitment to this term. Why did you do you have a special affinity for Diogenes? What's your story with that philosopher?
Um, no, I like the idea of cynicism, right? Not necessarily what it kind of grew into, but that just sort of core value of always asking questions, poking, prodding, never taking anything too seriously or face value. Right. And I think being from Utah, you don't necessarily find a lot of people like that here. You find a lot of people who are Mormon, right? Which again, I mentioned to you before this. I am heterodox, but I am. And then you find a lot of people who are stridently anti-Mormon here as well, right? Um, but you don't tend to have a lot of people who will step back and just be willing to ask questions and to be a little more skeptical and cynical about a lot of things. So that's where the name grew out of. I don't live in a barrel like the original Diogenes, so a little better off than that. But yeah, that's essentially what the name grew out of.
Well, it's a funny. I think the name means like son of God or of the tribe of God, descended from God, which is a pretty it's a pretty high appellation for a guy who lives in a barrel. But yeah, there's something very
That's,
pre-Christian about that in a way, like born in a manger, lives in a barrel,
mm-hmm.
that kind of stereotype. Also, the archetype of Odin being sort of like a wandering vagrant.
Yeah,
Um, there's that idea of God will appear in the world as as a weird kind of homeless schizophrenic guy, and you're gonna just dismiss him, but you should really listen to what he's saying
yeah,
because you could get on the wrong side of God. So you always respect a guest, you always respect a stranger, and kind of there's that ethos in Buddhism of like the monks. They get on the street and they beg for their food, and you could say that's to humble them and remind them to always, oh, you're always dependent on people and don't get arrogant. But it could also be reminding the people that, like, you know, God could appear to you as a humble person, and instead
yeah,
of just judging people based off their wealth and power and judging the book by its cover, you have to see some spiritual virtue beyond material wealth and presentation. So
mm-hmm.
um, when you talk about revolution, you say, uh, is a revolution possible? What are we talking about here? Revolutionary community. Um, is there a uh, I mean, how is this a coherent concept? The concept of utopia, or is this a like, do all utopias converge on like a platonic ideal? I mean, even like saying that is itself kind of a loaded question because like Plato has his own idea of a utopia that a lot of people would say is actually
Yeah,
dystopian and not utopian at
right.
all. So
Well,
is it possible, and is that even a good thing? Is it a good thing or a
yeah.
bad thing?
I think you bring up a good point, Plato, right? And I think it's cliche, but probably true because a lot of cliches end up being true that, you know, one man's utopia is another's dystopia, right? Like what one person would envision as paradise is another person's hell. When I talk about revolution, I mean, I think I talk about it or think about it in like that classical Marxist Leninist perspective, right? I went through a period politically where I was very much Marxist, not quite Leninist aligned, but very much in that far left field, we'll say, right? So that's where a lot of the thinking that here came out of. So when I think about revolution in that context, it's that 180-degree revolution, right? Where you're overthrowing the entire current system, where you're flipping around entirely, revolving, right, into something entirely new. I think that's the dream of any person who has a dream of a utopia or a revolutionary society, is that this society is not good. Thus, we need a revolution, a 180 turn into something better. Um, so looking at like the post that I had made a while ago, honestly, revolutionary community can be mapped onto whatever your idea of a revolutionary community is, right? But the fundamental question I asked there is it possible to even achieve that? Um, and having become more cynical, I don't think it is. I just the fact that there are so many different people with so many different ideas and so many different ideologies means that getting to somewhere that would be considered a utopia by everyone is probably not possible. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective.
So I guess I'll try to play devil's advocate here
Sure.
with this argument of the way I see it is there's two extreme perspectives. One is that it's almost a nominalist perspective, which is that what is good, if it exists at all, if we're gonna kind of preclude moral relativism and things like that.
Sure.
But if there is good, it's not something that you can arrive at, rationally through contemplation. It's not something that's
Yeah.
universally acceptable. It has to be divinely revealed. It's in a
Sure.
text. It's in a dream. It's something that you come upon, and it's instantiated personally. It's an anecdotal kind of
Yeah.
experience, and you can't you can't just use a bunch of math equations to go. So there's no like
Yeah.
mathematically perfect society. We're always going to have these flawed societies, and to the extent that there is an ideal or something that we're trying to do, that good is it's almost accidental in the sense of being miraculous. Like, we human beings are so flawed, we're like totally depraved animals, whatever. We could not come up with it on our own. It's not rational. I think sometimes this is an argument for Christianity that people will make, where it's like the morality of the Bible is so alien, it's so strange, it's so unlike, it's so undetermined by selfish, rational, Darwinism, that it clearly
Yeah.
could not have just come from the minds of men. It clearly must have come from God on high, because it just contradicts everything we know about the world. And then
Yeah.
I would say that the Platonic opposition to that is the idea, maybe there's some humility of understanding that, yes, humans are limited, we are complex, and so coming up with like a series of rules about how the perfect society should be. That's a difficult process, and it's subject to high variance noise, meaning that, like, as new technologies comes out, that changes, human social relations, gender relations, marriage, like the meaning of all these sacred things gets changed, reproduction, population expansion, we reduce mortality. Okay, that creates new economic conditions. But despite the fact that these things are very complex, and it's difficult to, quantify all of these things, that theoretically it is possible to arrange society in an optimal way. And that optimal way, I guess you could just say it's a sustainable society. It's a society that can survive and to compete in a Darwinian sense. And I would argue that, like, that's basically what science is. So science is kind of fundamentally utopian, and this is like kind of repeating the dialectic I just set up. There's within
Yeah.
science the idea that science is about skepticism and critique and tearing things down and tearing down authorities. But then there's a view of science that really what science is, it's about discovering an existing established order in the universe. It's about understanding the cosmos.
Sure.
So, that tension exists within, Socrates and Plato, where it's like
Yeah.
Socrates is always questioning, he's always breaking down authority, but then underneath that there is the logos. There is the idea that actually there are these universals, there is this platonic realm or something. So there's a tension between those two, and they seem like opposites. But the way that I see it is kind of like, if you want to build a house on the ruins of an old house, you have to come in with a wrecking ball. You have to destroy the
Sure.
old house. You have to build the new house. So
Yeah.
this is like these are the two extreme, the sort of anti-utopian pragmatic view or nominalist view, and then kind of a utopian universalistic scientific view, that even there's like a fractal within each of
Yeah.
these where you sort of can't escape the dialectic even if you think you're totally conservative and
Yeah.
I'm a conservative Christian. It's like, well, Christ was pretty revolutionary actually. And then it's like, no, I'm a Marxist Leninist. It's like, well, isn't that kind of like a dogmatic tradition that you're adhering to? So
Hmm.
there's this paradox of, human nature, even divine nature, going on here, and maybe that's part of the dual nature of Christ. So I guess that's my defense of utopianism, is that even as you try to escape it, like you can never really
Yeah.
not be a utopian.
That's true. And I mean, I think what I would almost argue for, in a sense, would be like a hybrid approach to to looking at this, right? Um, so you came with the example of, if you want to build a house, right, on the ruins of an old house, you have to demolish the old house before you can build the ruins. But there's still some existing knowledge there when it comes to building that house, and that knowledge has to come from somewhere. Um, and so the way I kind of, I guess, make things work in my own head, thinking about, okay, where are we going as a human species? Where have we come from? Um, is that we're pretty much doing a lot of this stuff on our own, right? We're here, we're working towards hopefully a better society. That's what science is for. Ideally, that's what philosophy would be for as well, married to science. Um, but then I do believe that there is a sort of divine that will occasionally inject in some wisdom here and there, right? Whether that's biblical, Quranic, being Mormon, Mormonistic, I guess you could say, and that there's these slight course corrections that the divine provides us with periodically. But for the most part, we are kind of on our own when it comes to building towards a utopic society, if one is possible. That would be my way of marrying those two concepts that you presented, right? And I think at a personal level, that's how I tend to look at it. Even though I don't think we can ever get to that utopic end point.
So when you talk about balance, it kind of reminds me of Taoism, and I was thinking about Chinese religion as oftentimes, and this is true of Indian religion as well, as people think of Chinese and Indian religion as, um, diverse and polytheistic, whatever, but ultimately it's one thing. It's like,
Yeah,
there's this seed, and over time it becomes more complicated, but there's this cohesive thing called Chinese religion, there's a cohesive thing called Indian religion. And I
yeah,
think that, when you break it down, you actually see there's a lot of distinctions. So Taoism is not Buddhism, is not Confucianism, is not animism, and
sure.
whatever else. So, and in Japan, Shintoism is kind of representing the animist branch. Um,
Yeah,
so I guess I think that I explain this diversity not purely through the fact that, well, we have these different metaphysical theories about the world. There are conservative theories and there are utopian theories, and there are these theories of human nature, and they're competing because, one of them is having difficulty proving the other right, and they kind of engage in this Talmudic argument over the centuries, and
Yeah.
sometimes one argument is dominant and becomes the dominant religion, and then the other, and it's like, okay, maybe there's an element to that, but I think much more in history, the question of which religion is dominant is much more a question of culture and ethnicity and invasion and military dominance than it is of like two people had a philosophical argument and
For
one was
sure.
convinced by the other.
Yeah.
Um, and certainly, in Mormonism, obviously early on, the early converts had to be people who were convinced of Mormonism, like, in New York, and as they were traveling
Yeah.
through Ohio and Illinois and
Yes.
everything, they
Yeah.
had to pick up people along the way.
Yeah,
Um,
we have some very intriguing family history stories from that period of time about, 'cause I mean, to go back a little bit, my own ancestors were like among the first 500 members of the church. So there's a lot of interesting like family records we have about that period. Um, but yeah, like convincing things happened. You know what I mean? Like for them at that time, like again, things get clouded over, dusted over, fogged over. Um, in the way people write down these experiences. But and this is just a minor aside on what you're saying, but it's like, yeah, they were things happened to them that were convincing, we can say.
there is this there is this thing within Mormonism where it is a movement of kind of consensual evangelical, meeting the people where they are and inspiring them. And then there's this other part of Mormonism which is maybe material or symbolic, but it's the idea of becoming a new Israel and leaving the land that behind and entering into a new wild land and conquering that new land. I mean, when I was in Utah, I think I was in Provo and I was walking up one of these little mountains, and there's some information about a battle that happens between the Mormon pioneers and the Native Americans in that area. And it's like, if the Mormons had been cowardly or pacifistic, then they would have they would have run away from the battle and gone back home, or they would have
Yeah.
all died or something. So there's an element there that mirrors, what the Pilgrims had to do. Not necessarily directly, we had Thanksgiving, but then eventually King Philip's Wars. Like, there are moments of decision where you're faced with eradication, annihilation, and you have to survive as a military force. And, the Mormons had to do that. There was no reinforcements from the United States government coming to
Yeah.
save them. So it's like you're completely alone. And that story of the pioneers going across the plain and, doing something that it's it's kind of it's kind of unpaired. I mean, there are a lot of stories of people traveling from one place to another and starting a new colony, but in terms of the sheer distance and also the lack of infrastructure support and the fact that like you're passing through like the biggest mountains in North America and the
Yeah.
desert, it would sort of be like if colonists from India like passed over the Himalayas and they went in the Gobi Desert and they found an oasis and they started a colony there. So just on the geographical scale, it is pretty daunting in physical terms to think about walking. Like, now we have cars and trains and planes and
Yeah.
all that stuff, but to think about having to walk and figure all of that out at the same time being surrounded by hostile tribes and then allying with some other tribes, um, and somehow like finding the one, like having the faith to like be like, hey guys, there's an oasis, there's a promised land out there. I know everything so far is sucked and we're leaving all the good farmland behind and we're just going into some terrible places, but like once we get over that mountain, there's going to be a nice valley. I swear we're gonna have a great city someday there. Yeah, like there's a lot of fanatical utopianism that had to go into that.
Oh, 100%. No, fanatical utopianism and grit, right? Just to be able to do that. Like you think about, it's hard to imagine now, like you mentioned you've been here to Utah before. It's hard to imagine now, but like just how barren these, like the Salt Lake and Utah valleys were. Because there's like, it's like completely covered over by sprawl, right? It's just houses, suburbs, etc. Um, but on those little patches of the valley that are left, it's scrub, right? It's scrub oak, it's uh, just nothing basically. And so to not only go all that distance then to get here and have Brigham Young was the prophet at the time say like this is it, this is the spot. You have to have a bit of religious fervor to be like, yeah, no, this desert is the spot. This is where we're gonna pick up or set down. So it is interesting to look back at that sort of utopic sense. And maybe, I mean, getting into my own little personal history here, right? Like some of my ancestors were some of the first people to join the church. Some of my ancestors before them were some of the first people to come over with pilgrims, right? 1632. Um, they came over. So that perhaps there's just something in genetically in me that makes me think about these things or interested in utopian ideas, but it does go quite a ways back in the bloodline.
Well, that's something I guess I don't know if it frightens me or I'm a little bit uh disappointed maybe is the word. Not to be too down on you, but it's like I do hear this story of like I've been to St. George and I go in the
Sure.
museum and I'm looking through genealogies and I'm like, yeah, there a lot of these people first they come over on the Mayflower, which is an incredible story, and I've written about that, the decline of the wasp. That you had a very small group of people facing extreme conditions of starvation. People had tried that before. They weren't the first people to try to come over to North America. A lot of people had tried it, and they all died or they went back because
Yeah.
they couldn't handle the conditions. And the place where they landed in Plymouth, it's not a great place for farming. Actually, it's basically a
No.
sandbar.
Yeah.
So the fact that they committed to that, they ended up in the wrong place. They were trying to go to New York. They ended up in the complete wrong state. And they figured it out and they made it work. And then a lot of those people's descendants, went to Utah. They made it work. And now we're in a position today where there's not really a lot of wild, free lands left to go to that are uncivilized, unmapped, and so it's like, what's a Mormon man to do? What do you got to go to space? You got to go to Mars. You
Right?
got to go somewhere, the bottom of the ocean or something. You
Yeah.
seasteading. But I think there's something tragic about living in a world without the possibility for adventure, and
Yeah.
I see that there's this kind of resignation toward the Taoism of, well, all things in balance, and I think of the Mormons. I mean, I'm not a smoker or a drinker either, but I
Sure.
think there's this sensibility which is nice. I mean, it's nice that the Amish, for example, don't use technology. I mean, it's nice, but it's also, I was driving, down the highways of America, and I was passing by an Amish coach and buggy, and I was thinking about the kids, the 12-year-old Amish boy in the back of the buggy, and I was like, if I was that
Yeah.
kid, I'd be like, Mom, can we just get a car? Can we just like race past? I'm tired of being raced past by these people. And
Yeah.
you go back and you read these stories of these people who did these incredible things, and it's like I'm tired of living in a world where we just have to sit down and we can't, I don't drink coffee either, but it's like we just have to sit down and be reasonable and be nice and like, and just build up the 401k basically and just have this like very I don't know, it's almost the
Sustain.
lack of
Yeah.
adventure is troubling.
Yeah. Hey, you could always go volunteer for Ukraine. I'm sure they're.
No,
I'm
but
sure they're
I'll
looking for
say, you know what? I'm going
volunteers.
to say something because you're going to set me off here. So Ukraine, it's like you have trench warfare, World War I style. It is
Yeah.
not the same. There's a huge
It's not an
difference
adventure.
between if you're a pilgrim in 1619, 1620 Mayflower, or you're a follower of Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, and you're going west. Those people had no clue. They didn't know.
Yes.
They thought they were going to go meet some descendants of the Israelites, or they thought they were going to
Hmm.
go meet some giants or something. I mean, it was totally unknown. And versus Ukraine, it's like we know what happens in Ukraine. We know that you're going
Yeah.
to be put into a meat grinder, and there's this percentage that you die. And it doesn't matter how big or strong or fast or gritty you are. If you get blown
Yeah.
up by a drone, you get blown up by a drone, and it's
Yeah.
just like playing Russian roulette. And
Yeah.
it's a very different from a psychological perspective. Going to Ukraine is not an adventure. It's like it's basically turning up the hellishness of an office bureaucracy, and like instead of
Yeah.
getting yelled at by your boss or the HR lady, you're getting bombed and drone striked. So
Yeah.
that's the distinction that I think that modern warfare, like I don't even think the Pilgrims and the Mormons were really. There's a huge difference between being like being cannon fodder and being like, I'm gonna start a new civilization. I'm gonna start a utopia. I'm gonna go
Yeah. You at
somewhere
least
no
have a
one's ever been
chance.
before.
You
You
at least,
know?
you at least have a chance. Yeah. No, I mean, your comparison there is apt, and it does make me think about when I think about the Ukraine war and the people who have volunteered, which part of me is like, great, that's what you want to do, awesome. But I compare that to folks who volunteered for like the Spanish Civil War, right? Um, and when I think about it in that context, I think of one that was probably an adventure for many of those people. And I think about the art and culture that came out of that, right? You have George Orwell, you have, dozens of other artistic figures that came out of that. And you compare that to Ukraine, right? And I just really doubt that we're going to get that same level of artistic creation to have come out of that conflict. Because conflicts do tend to, in the past at least, create or have quite a artistic flowering, I guess you could say, at least from the ashes or graves of the conflict itself. Um, but no, you're right. There really isn't a whole lot of adventure left. When you mentioned that, like, what's a Mormon boy to do, right? Most of them go into business and make a killing, right? Because there's that's I don't want to necessarily call that adventurous, but there is sort of that entrepreneurial, a word I can't say right there, adventurous spirit that one of the few places left. And again, I feel like you probably have a good argument against this, but that's one of the few places left where you can go and maybe do something that is new or different or adventurous, same with tech, right? You see a lot of Mormons in tech, because that is a place where the internet and technology is a frontier. Um, it's intriguing to look back and see over the last century how many scientists, people in tech, politicians sometimes, and businessmen have been Mormon or come from Mormonism to some degree or another. I think you're all right in that there is that adventurous spirit, but there's just not very many places to channel it anymore. At least not when it comes to sort of society or culture building.
Right. Yeah, I guess I would agree with you that I still I think that there are distinctions between starting a business and
Yeah, it's
going off
not.
in the
It's
wilderness, but
definitely.
I think that as far as what is possible, I think that it's probably true that um, I don't know, kind of taking risks and trying something new and doing something maybe unknown, and you don't know what the result of it will be, probably is the closest that people can do. And I guess that is what um gives me hope, because I think that living in a world where everything is predetermined, there's a sense of a loss of destiny, a loss of agency, and it
Yeah.
is kind of a feeling of imprisonment that you know it's all about following the rules. It's about getting the right credentials, and it's I'm almost and I'm sure there are other people who are having an existential crisis right now, because I know people, and it's men and women, but I've seen people where their entire life is like getting a degree. And I remember at one point uh talking with a student and saying like, hey, I could help you out with this, or I could do this assignment for you, and they'd be like, no, then my credential wouldn't be real or something. And it's like, it's really, I think it's a religion. If you tour the Ivy League campuses, obviously a lot of the kids who tour there with their parents are on their phones or something, but there are people who
Yeah.
like really still in 2025 look at the Ivy League as like, in the way that some Christians would perceive like going to Bible college, and maybe even more so.
Yeah.
Um, so,
No, I mean, I can, from my own perspective, I can speak to that. I went to school for English, literary studies. My plan was to go into academia. Um, Specifically, I wanted to get a PhD in comparative literature, right? That was like my dream. And then I got to a point in my life where, I just finished, well, I was in my last year of school and, I'm married. I have two kids, right? So at this time, we just had our daughter. Um, and start trying to make the PhD academia side of it work with having like a family and what my wife wanted to accomplish, it just wasn't going to work. Right. Like I, at that time, I remember talking to a professor who was saying, like, I think you'd do great in the PhD program. But he said, if you're doing a PhD in the humanities, he's like, prepare yourself for 10 years of poverty. Right. Because that's what you're looking at. 5 years of a PhD program where you're not going to be making any money, and then 5 years after that where you're not going to be making any money. And I was like, that takes me into my late 30s, right? And I remember telling my wife that, and her just like bursting into tears. And I was like, okay, you know, I had to really sit back and think, and like changing my perspective of academia and changing like, okay, what can I do outside of that, was almost like leaving a religion, right? Where I had to completely shift my mindset and what I was capable of as a person, because I had so totally worked myself up to being like, this is the only thing I can be good at is a professor, right? Like this is what I'm meant to do. And so having to shift that mindset was hard. There's a brutal mindset shift. And I will say I'm better for it probably, but yeah, you are right to call that sort of mindset a religious mindset.
yeah, it's really difficult to go through a process as a person where you build up, and I've seen it happen, and it pains me, I guess, on some empathetic level. It pains me to see people build up this idea of, this is my perfect life because all the authorities in my life are telling me to go to college and to be the
Mm-hmm.
best I can be and do all this stuff. And then you see, like, you watch people go at various stages in that process, and you see those points of disappointment. You realize, like, no matter how credentialed you are, no matter how many, points you get from those authority figures, like, that's that's not necessarily going to make you happy. You might hit all of those, be like, yeah, I finally made it and I did everything I was supposed to do, and you can still be like, oh, okay, now I'm here and it's actually not even what I wanted to do. I don't even know what I wanted to do because I never
Yes.
really investigated that or asked myself, am I even passionate about anything other than like
Mm-hmm.
satisfying the desires of other people? So
Yeah.
that's really tragic to me to think about. And now I'm seeing with AI, people are seeing this stuff about all these people cheating, and we're entering into this very strange. It's kind of revolting because it would be, like, again, if you would go back to like how Luther felt about the indulgences of like,
Yes.
no, I mean, salvation is something that's like a personal relationship between you and God, and you people are sullying it by just selling it out. And that's
Yes.
how I think a lot of people are going to feel with this. I mean, you can't and almost, and then you start to think, wait a second, why are people able to cheat in this way? Like, why is it so easy? It's like,
Yeah.
maybe the degree that I had, if an AI can basically write those
Do that
papers for
degree.
me, then did the things that I wrote have any value at all? And it does become
Yeah.
existential of like, does human labor even have any value? Like, what is the economy? What is my job? What are we doing here? What is civilization? If
Yeah.
we're just going to be replaced by robots was any of it ever worth it? And what is the alternative? If our labor is useless, what is the alternative?
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge. I mean, David Graeber talks about bullshit jobs, and there's
Yeah.
other, theories of basically being alienated from your labor from that
Yeah.
Marxist perspective of, does this labor have inherent value? Is it creative? Is it artistic? And I think
Yeah.
when I talk about the value of adventure, it's about a journey that is, spiritual, has spiritual meaning in itself, regardless of the outcome. Whether you're not exact, you don't know what the consequence is going to be. And so there's
Yeah.
no credential coming at the end of it. It's valuable in itself.
Yeah. This does make me think to pitch my own Substack here. I wrote, I don't know if you checked this one out, but it's called The Seafarer. It's one of my more recent posts, right? It's a translation of an ancient, not ancient, but like an Anglo-Saxon poem. Worth reading, worth looking up. Ezra Pound did a translation of it that's amazing, right? But the general thrust of this is that it's from the perspective of a seafarer, right? It doesn't specify what he does. Could be a fisherman, could be a Viking, right? Whatever. But most of the poem, he talks about how terrible being a seafarer is. And it's just hard. It's brutal. It's not fun. But then towards the end of the poem, he compares his life to the good life of someone who lives in a city, and ultimately says, this is better, right? Because I'm following my destiny. I'm, doing things that are bold. I'm, going on these voyages. I'm living life essentially, right? Which is something that the comfortable person in the city can never experience, despite having a comfortable life. And I think, to your point, it's just harder and harder to find that now. That sort of lifestyle. I mean, back 1,000 years ago, this would have been a lifestyle that I think that would have been fairly common depending on where you lived, right? Where you were doing something brave and bold for your daily job. And now we go in and write emails, and it just doesn't have that same sense of adventure.
I always have to play devil's advocate, so I'll say that
It's fine.
I
Push back, please.
I think that, so all of this stuff that we're saying here, the world is getting terrible and there's nothing fun to do,
I
and
wouldn't say terrible, but I would say narrower.
right. Our opportunities for adventure are slipping away, and it's like born too late to explore the world, born too early to explore the
Yes.
stars, born just in time to work the Zoom Excel spreadsheet and
Yeah.
ChatGPT. So to push back on this narrative, um, ancient peoples had myths that were always about the past. That in the past there's these heroes.
Yes.
They did
It
these
was
amazing
better.
things, and it was this golden age. And now we live in this kind of fallen era where people are not amazing and they're not doing these
Yeah.
amazing things, and so I think that bias is always there because it's an excuse, because it's a great kind of cover story for, like, oh yeah, people used to do this cool stuff, but we can't do it anymore for whatever reason. um how many, I mean, there's there is this loss of control, this agency that people perceive as something imposed upon them from outside, that we're being
Yeah.
forced to eat the bugs and live in the pod, our
Yeah.
agency is being taken from us. But I would turn that around and say that is a convenient excuse, that almost
100%.
your benevolent overseer is saying, hey, if you want to blame us, if you want to blame everything on, George Soros and Bill Gates, and say that Klaus Schwab is controlling your life and this is why you can't be a, Bronze Age warrior, it's like, yeah, you know what? We'll let you, you can blame us just like you blame your mom and your dad and everyone else for making you who you are today. But
Yeah.
that's actually bullshit. That's actually an excuse. That's not the truth.
Yes.
The truth is that moment to moment, we choose if we want to live a comfortable life in the city. There are weird and wacky things that people could get up to. I remember seeing something on Twitter about a guy was like, hey, I'm going to explore this site in the Amazon jungle that I think has like some hidden ruins. And if you want to come with me,
Yeah.
respond to this. And it's like, people can, or people could pursue that. And I think some of it does come down to like physicality. And I'm, looking at this poem, and it's like, yeah, it is. People don't think like, oh, I'm gonna be a pirate, I'm gonna sail the world. It's like, yeah, and when it rains, you're gonna get rained on, and it's gonna be cold. And if you've ever been on a boat in the ocean when it's raining, I don't care if it's 70 degrees in the Caribbean or something. When it's raining and it's windy and you're on a boat, like, and you're
Cold.
soaking wet, it's cold, and you get sick, and the bread is moldy. And like there's
Mhm.
stuff that sucks. I mean, there's this guy at Substack, worst boyfriend ever, and I wrote an article about him,
Oh
and
yeah.
people hate him and everything. But it's like, one of the things I like is this, the fact that he's like, I'm living a bad life, I'm leaving my life behind, and I'm leaving, and I'm gonna go do some yard work on some rich guy's property or
Yeah.
something. It's like, doing that, I almost feel like everyone should do that. One of the articles that I can never remember if I've already published or if it's coming in the pipeline, but oh, I think it was the Against Technocracy, and I was saying, look, like, we should be taking college kids and being like, oh, you want a degree? Well, I mean, we're not going to, why should we even bother giving you an exam? Because you're just going to cheat on the
Yeah.
exam or whatever. You're just going to memorize it, forget it the next day. What we should do is we're going to like, we're gonna drop you off in Alaska, and see how you survive in the Alaskan wilderness. And if you want to sign up for that, and you want to volunteer for that, and you can survive, and you're like, yeah, 1% of you are gonna die, and it just is what it is. And if you're willing to sign up for that, then that is an experience that is transformative, that actually does give you a new sense of an identity. Like, you actually have gone through a rite of passage, and you're a different
Yeah.
person now. And that means you are different, because most people are not willing to do that. It's
Yeah.
hard. And therefore, if we want a society that is adventurous, we have to privilege adventurous people, and we have to
Yeah.
basically have affirmative action for adventurous people. And if we don't, the people who end up ruling over us are going to be the credentialists who check all the boxes.
Yeah.
That's
I think that
democracy.
does, yeah, and that does. So you brought up two things that I think are interesting. One, kind of to your latter point here, um, and this is from my own personal experience, right? As you probably know, Mormons go on missions, and I think, a lot of people think, oh, you're knocking doors, right? But it is 2 years away from literally everything that you know about your entire life, right? And something that I hear often, even from people who have left the Mormon church, consider themselves anti-Mormon at this point, they still talk about their mission very fondly. Like that 2 years, or women have shorter missions, like 18 months. They talk about that period extremely fondly because it is what you're talking about. It's a situation where you are completely forced out of your normal way of life and forced through a rite of passage that really transforms and changes you as a person, right? Like I lived in Chile for 2 years. That was my Mormon mission. And it entirely changed me as a person. I was like a little, conservative, Glenn Beck liking Utah white boy, right? Before I went on my mission. And then living in Chile for 2 years and, learning about Pinochet, learning about the dirty wars in Argentina, and then seeing how a left leaning government could actually work enough and help people entirely changed my world perspective. And along with all that, just having to live somewhere else in a different culture and experience it for 2 years, I think changes you as a person. So I read that Against Technocracy today, and I was like, yes, I agree with this. We should force people to do things like this because it is mind and spirit altering, you could say. And I think and then kind of going back to your earlier point, you mentioned how a lot of times we have bullshit excuses for things, right? Like, oh, the man is keeping me down, the man is preventing me from doing things. This is a whole nother, side of my own little story here, but that attitude was something that pushed me away from that far left ideology that's pretty common in the United States now, right? Because I just got tired of blaming everything on other people. Um, I think like even from a leftist perspective, and funnily enough, you make this in your Against Technocracy article that came out recently. You bring up you bring up Lenin, right, as an example, and that's someone I always think of who's like that was a very left person who was extremely high agency, and who just went out and did things. Or Trotsky or Mao, right? We don't necessarily need to call them good people or that they did necessarily good things, but they did things. They had that agency and they took it. Um, and looking at the left now, I don't see many people like that on the left, people who are willing to exercise that degree of agency and that degree of risk um, in order to, this is almost coming full circle here, but to bring about a revolutionary community that they think would be utopic.
Yeah, I mean there is clearly a movement away from the propaganda of the deed to the propaganda of the committee meeting, and there's a there's a dynamic that I mean it existed before the internet, and actually there's a lot of leftist conspiracy. I mean now the conspiracy movement has moved to the right, but if you're on the far left, there's a history of conspiracy theories where any incompetence, any um, infighting within the left is that's CIA agent provocateurs who come in,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
there's
COINTELPRO, of course.
well, specifically, there was a post I saw, and it was like, here's a list of the things that the CIA instructs their agent provocateurs to do. And it's like, go into the meeting and be long winded and interrupted and bring up irrelevant points and always try to circle back to things that have already been resolved and bring up those things again and insist that everything be done procedurally and, always kind of caution against rash actions. And the comment was like, I mean, how do you distinguish this kind of behavior from actual, like, the personality of people who want to go in and be narcissistic and make it all about
Mm-hmm.
them and prevent anything from actually being done? And so, that behavior, of course, existed before the internet, but I think the internet exacerbates that because there's a horde of people who really their life is dedicated to critique in a way that is very radical. It's not utopian, but it is. I see some of these commenters online because they'll leave hundreds of comments,
Yeah.
and they're all very critical. And I see these people, and I notice they're leaving. It's not just my blog; they leave hundreds of comments on other people's blogs, and they start to leave like little details about their life. And so they're like, "Oh, I'm a remote worker." And I only work a couple hours a day, and then I spend all my time, commenting on blogs online. And they're very critical comments. And I'm thinking, this person has a huge amount of Schadenfreude. They really enjoy, tearing other people down, explaining like why you're not far right enough, or you're not far left enough, and you're not pure enough, and you're an
Uh,
idiot, and here's why this will never work. But they don't have a blog. They've written hundreds of comments. They've written blog length comments on other people's blogs. They don't have a blog. They don't want to positively assert themselves or a vision or saying, "Hey, come follow me. I have the right ideas." All they
yeah.
want to do is critique others. And so it's a very passive aggressive, because to be an aggressive person, you have to say, "Here I am. This is who I am. This is what I stand for. This is what I advocate. Come on, bring on the critique. Like I'm going to withstand
Mm-hmm.
it." But if you're just sort of snidely from the sidelines saying, "Oh, well, you're not pure enough, you're not good enough, and that's bad," but you're never, putting out your own ideas, then yeah, that is it is a very it's a very sadistic behavior, but it's a sadism that it never owns its own power. It never says, "You know what, I'm going to attack you, but I'm also going to make myself vulnerable." It's
Yeah,
basically like the ethos of a sneak attack, a stab in the back.
for sure.
So, I see that behavior, and I think the internet exacerbates it through anonymity, because the person who's shouting at you in the comments, if it's a crowd of people or something. I actually in my article on Ayala, I referenced the ancient Greeks and how they had all these bylaws of how to conduct a meeting. And they said,
Yeah.
don't bring up the same thing multiple times in the same day, and don't shout, and don't threaten people, and don't disrespect people. And there's all this list of things you can't do. And it's like those are a list of like forum posting rules from 2,500 years ago that are still
Yeah.
relevant today. And they had to have those rules. And so if someone broke those rules, they said, and if someone breaks these rules, we're going to fine them money. We're going to fine them. We're going to charge them money. We're going to throw them out of the assembly. Well, if we have like an open free marketplace of ideas or whatever, then, and you have all these anonymous accounts butting in, giving their 2 cents, and people engage in these behaviors, there's no one finding them. There's no one, and the people who get banned, unfortunately, a lot of the people getting banned, it's not because they're breaking rules of good discourse. It's because their ideas are offensive, right?
Yeah.
But there's nothing in good bylaws about, oh, if your ideas are offensive or something, or people disagree with you, then you get thrown out. And so we've kind of inverted the rules of discourse to be, you can kind of behave as badly as you want as long as as long as you never put forward your own program, then you're
Yeah.
safe. Then you can, as long you're calling everybody else an idiot or whatever, that behavior is encouraged, that kind of troll behavior. But if you like put forth your own visionary ideas and they offend people or whatever, then that's kind of where the hammer has come down, at least over the last, I don't know, 10 years. We've had various waves of censorship and
For sure.
relaxation and so on. So I guess that is my current diagnosis of the problem. And then the solution is you have to cultivate a space where there is accountability, where if someone wants to call you an idiot, they have to call you an idiot with some kind of skin in the game, where you could, like, they punch you, you punch them back. And if you
Yeah.
don't have that dynamic of skin in the game, then discourse can't get anywhere, because there's no risk. In order for discourse to be adventurous, it has to be risky. And if there's no, and of course, like, it's a complicated thing. I don't want to just say, oh yeah, if no one if everyone was not anonymous or something, that would solve the problem, right? So there's layers to the problem. But
Yeah.
anyway, that's my theory on why there's kind of this circle jerk of, oh, we can't do anything, and nothing is possible, and everything's vacillating between the extreme black pilling and critique and blaming elites, and always blaming,
Yeah.
they did this to us and we can't do anything about it, and so we're going to complain. And it's like, there's never an admission of responsibility, that you have a responsibility to do something. What exactly that looks like, in order to even have that discussion, you have to show up, you have to assert, you need to move from being passive aggressive to aggressive. And some
Yeah.
people are not capable of that, for kind of, you alluded to, like, being a young man and then going through a process to get to where you are today. There's a delayed adolescence where people never go through that process. And so if you try to be a man without ever having to go through the process of kind of being humbled or humiliated or whatever, then you just sound like you just sound like a screaming child. So
100%.
maybe I shouldn't tell the trolls to just show up and be themselves or whatever. Maybe that's not the best advice. But this is I guess I see, if people feel like, oh, I can't do anything, it's like, well, the person who's responsible for that feeling is the person you need to look in the mirror at, not some
Yeah.
abstract entity in Washington, D.C. or something. That's my rant.
No, I agree. That's it. I'm glad you diagnosed the problem, and then I was going to be like, oh, but what's the solution? Because you just can't critique it and not provide a solution. But hey, you walked the walk. You had a solution there for that. It does get me thinking too about, this is something I think a lot about, since I do tend to come at things more culturally. I have, like I mentioned, an English and literary background. Is that I feel like culturally and artistically we're in the same boat, right? Where there's no forward movement. Politically online, we talk about where we want to go politically. As you mentioned, it is just this circle jerk where we're not really going anywhere. We're not really doing anything new or creating anything new ideologically. That's a pet peeve of mine, when people continually bring up Marx on the left, right, or whatever, the founding fathers on the right. I'm like, really? Have we not come up with anything better? Or do you not have something to add to that? But artistically, I feel like we're in the same boat. Um, when was the last time like a new genre of music happened? When was the last time a new art form happened? Right? Um, it seems like it happens less and less. And that could just be me having a blinkered view of it. I'm wholly willing to admit that maybe I'm just not as plugged in as I should be to the culture. But like the novel as an art form now is how many hundreds of years old? Even film feels like an antiquated 20th century artifact. Um, and it just feels like we're spinning our wheels a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so here's my counter argument.
I was gonna say I knew I would know you would have one, so I'm excited to hear what it is.
Here's my counter argument. So, I believe that techno music, EDM, drum and bass, dubstep, I think that's an ancient form of music. And the reason we don't have a record of that is because it's so ancient, is before people were ever notating music or writing things down. So if you look at,
All right.
there's like, you search like EDM beatboxing on YouTube or something. It's
Yeah.
very clear that people are capable of producing those tonalities and melodies and sound. You can produce that, the
Yeah.
fricatives and the vocatives, everything, the human vocal cords combined with PVC pipe and whatever else, you can produce all the sounds that you need for these forms of music. So the idea that
Yeah.
there is any new form of music, I'm inherently suspicious of that. And the reason why I'm suspicious of that is because music is not an objective experience, it's a subjective experience that activates in the same way that if I smoke weed, which I don't, but if I did smoke weed and I ingested that THC and all those, psychoactive elements,
Yeah.
it's not introducing something that my body doesn't recognize. The reason why the drug works is because my body, my mind, recognizes the substance as similar enough to a substance that my body already produces. So it's like a puzzle piece being put into a puzzle and activating that,
Yeah.
and then I become high, right? So with music, I think it's a similar process where certain tonalities, certain melodies are inserting themselves, and they're activating certain structures that already exist. And therefore, if somebody says like, "Oh, and we invented techno music in the 90s," it's like, "No, we discovered techno music in the same way we discovered the continent of North and South America. It was already there. It was just not known to people, and so we discovered it. We realized, oh, you can have an EDM rave and stuff. So
Yeah.
but all of that, the resonance was already implicit, and I think, it's just probabilistically, I think we had those forms of music. We just kind of forgot them, and it's not an
Sure.
accidental thing necessarily, but also there's the intentionality of what type of resonance do you want to produce? Do you want a rave, or do you want a ballet? Do you want an opera? So different forms of music produce different forms of culture. So I don't
Yes.
see it as um, there's one teleological view of progress that sees this, ladder where you're just discovering new things and new things and new culture and new art and new music. And
Yeah.
I'm viewing it as something deep, like an iceberg, and you're going down deep into the subconscious of
Yeah.
humanity that already exists, and you're discovering things, structures, and you're just bringing them out. It's like when you put salt in the soup, you're
Sure.
bringing out an existing flavor. Um, and that's kind of the Platonic idea, is you're never actually inventing anything, you're just remembering something, you're discovering something that was already there. And that's
Yeah.
that's like my view of art and culture. And so when people say, oh, we don't have any new stuff anymore, um, I don't see it so much as like, well, therefore the problem is to, or the solution to not having all this new music and new art and new culture is like, we just need to be creative enough, or it,
Sure.
to me, it's about, we might have to forget certain things in order to have new art and music and culture. It might be that we're too super saturated with memory,
Mm,
that's why we feel like nothing new can be discovered,
mm,
because we have we've it's just as we were saying about the Earth, right? Every inch of the planet has been mapped out, so there's nothing new to discover. Well, it's sort of the
yeah.
same thing with music. We might have to forget certain forms of music in order to
Mm.
rediscover them.
You're speaking my language now because this is actually something that I've thought a lot about in relation to. I don't know if you've ever read much of Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer. Okay, so you've heard of him though, probably, right? I'm sure. Famous writer, right? And he has a couple of stories that play with these ideas of like total knowledge. There's a story about a guy who falls off his horse, hits his head, and then can suddenly recall everything that's ever happened to him, right? So, like, if you were to sit down and remember a specific day, it would take him an entire day to remember that day, right? Um, and uh, I think the story is called Funes el Memorioso, Funes the Memorias. Worth reading. I've got like the first three things I posted on Substack last year are all about this. Um, but Borges looks at this guy who, is basically a living computer and makes the judgment or makes the comparison that, look, this guy can remember everything that's ever happened to him, but then when you try and get him to act or think creatively, he can't. It's impossible. He can't imagine something new. He can't think creatively. And the key reason he cannot do that is because he can't forget. Those things can't sink into his subconscious and become something new. They're frozen as they were. Um, and it kind of, let me see if I can find it here real quick. It kind of, it reminds me of there's a Nietzsche quote
Yeah, I mean,
that
Nietzsche
is,
talks about memory and how you have to forget things in order to be renewed, and that memory is a kind of a prison. I mean, that's what regret is, and I think in a Christian sense, maybe this is a Nietzschean interpretation of Christianity, is that when people are weighed down by the guilt of sin, then they really have no repentance is about turning away from your sin, but you could also say it's about turning away from the memory and replaying that trauma over and over again, and reminiscing or having
yeah,
remorse, or saying, oh, I wish I could do that again, or oh, I wish I could go back and not do that, or what could I have done differently. And when I talk to a lot of men, younger men, older men, there's a consistent problem of rumination, and
yeah,
so much time and energy that we don't even know, because you might do it in the course of a day, and I think a lot of the procrastination and distraction seeking is a kind of ritual of absolution, trying to distract oneself, and alleviate the rumination and the regret and the reminiscing of, oh, I wish I had done this differently. I wish I had been born differently. It's like anyone who's read Harry
yeah,
Potter is like, oh, I wish I was born. I wish they took me to Hogwarts and I didn't grow up in this
yeah,
lame town with these lame parents and so on. So, I think that weight of the past and regretting and going back and thinking, oh, I could have done it differently, people don't realize how much time and energy that takes up. And if you're able to somehow miraculously be absolved of the duty of having to carry around the past on your
yeah,
back all the time, it's almost like a superpower, because there's a level of confidence that children have when you see a child walk up to a stranger and give them a hug, or just sort of give their thoughts. You ask a child a philosophical question, where did we come from, they'll just tell you. If you ask a
yeah,
teenager, they'll sort of grunt at you angstily, and if you ask an adult, they'll be like, I don't know, man. I don't know what to tell you. It's like I'm not that smart, or um there you notice this process that happens as we gain a sense of our own personal history, is we lose that kind of childlike confidence, which is it's not like a narcissistic arrogance. I mean, maybe children are kind of self-centered in their own way, but Um,
Yes.
it's not coming from, a narcissist is desperate to be liked. It's desperate. It's like, has this sense of insecurity that I need people to like what I have to say and agree with me and be at the center of attention. And that's distinct from just kind of genuinely and without any pretense being yourself, and kind of being yourself, and not thinking about, oh, what do people think about me, and I have to act in a certain way. and I
Yeah.
and I think that's, these two phenomena are related. The regret that people feel, the rumination, the remorse, the reminiscing, and then this lack of confidence of, oh, I don't know what to do with my life. And a lot of people structure it in terms of romantic relationships, like, I don't know how to talk to girls, I don't know how to make friends. But it's also like,
Yeah.
I don't know how to go on an adventure, I don't know how to start a business, I don't know what I want to do in life, I don't know what my passion is, I'm lost, and I'm confused. I think that sense of confusion, that mental fog, is like a self-defense mechanism, that is a way of numbing and a way of obscuring, because looking at, there's a scene in the Bhagavad Gita where Arjuna has the forms of God revealed to him, and it's sort of the
Yeah.
classic scene where it's like, in the Bible as well, seeing the face of God, will strike you down dead, because it's just so overwhelming to see
Yeah.
and seeing the face of God. It's really seeing your own face, because we're made in the image of God. It's seeing your own face, with the eyes of God, being able to see past, present, and future, and everything in its full scope. And it's just totally
Yeah.
overwhelming. And versus on the opposite hand, you have the covering over and the confusion of the emotional suppression, of the distraction, saying, you know what, I'm not going to look at my life. I'm going to be in a state of confusion, because then I can avoid that, like, horrifying abyss of the infinite of possibilities, and feeling
Mhm.
those extreme emotions, romantic emotions, adventurous emotions. It's like too much. So yeah, having a like the death of God, having a sacrifice of God, having like an ultimate Gerardian experience where you can kind of like give all of that up, and it's like, you know there's some sort of symbolic release and catharsis, whether that comes in the form of a ritual, or like a born again moment or something. I think that is kind of what religion is trying to do. It's trying to solve this problem of memory, that maybe a primordial society, a pre-literate culture doesn't have to deal with that in the same way. But it's like, where are the books written? It's written in the book of life, right? So
Yeah.
the connection between the memory and literacy and sin, very deep, uh, and it is in some senses a new problem, in the sense that, like, literacy is a new technology, but the fact that it's, however many thousands of years old, it also makes it an old
Yeah.
technology at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, just that last little bit you touched on, we do have a unique problem now in that more is being remembered and is not necessarily. And I have such like a torn relationship with this idea, but like more is being remembered and held on to now than has ever been in the past, right? We have the internet, we have this huge proliferation of literacy books, everything that's out there that just doesn't allow us to forget the past. My own pushback against this is all the many things that have been erased from the internet and that we don't know about anymore, right? Like my favorite example is all those GeoCities websites from Yahoo that are now, people spent years building and making, and then Yahoo took those down and they're gone. The internet was supposed to fix that whole problem of things being erased, but you're right. Like if there's not a mechanism to forget, if there's not a mechanism to let go of things, which religion helps with, um, then you do carry those things around, and that does create a sort of spiritual baggage that does weigh on you, right? Individually, culturally. Um, I think circling back to what I was talking about with art, we maybe aren't able to discover new parts of that iceberg, things that we've forgotten, because we are holding on to so much. Um, you can only hold on to so many things before you're unable to grab anything else.
On the topic of the GeoCities,
Yeah.
so that idea of infinite archiving, or we can store so many terabytes of data on a flash drive, and therefore nothing will ever be erased. If you made a video of yourself when you're 10 years old, it's going to be here until the death of the sun or something. And
Yeah.
now what we're seeing is AI is coming in, and it's creating all of this fake hallucinogenic data, and it's
Yeah.
producing it at a rate, like if you were to look at the exponential curve of data and you say, okay, over time people are writing books and we get the printing press and it's up and up and up and up, and you were to compare all of the data that we've ever produced before in history, and then you were to compare it with like the last couple months, and you were to graph all of that out, it would just be completely asymptotic. It would
Oh
be,
yeah.
okay, we're creating all this data, and then all of a sudden it just scales so much that everything that came before it seems like a drop in the bucket. And I think that in itself, there's this myth of the flood, that you had this human civilization and you had cities and things were going on, and then it was flooded. I think we're kind of going through a data flood where we're not going to be able to tell what's real and fake. Um, and so there's going to have to be either a literal purge or kind of a metaphorical purge where everyone just says, you know what? We just have to discount basically everything. If you see something, the value of that data, it would be like if I woke up and I said, hey, I had a dream last night that, you died. And you'd be like, well, that was just a dream. And we're going to have the same reaction to like a news story. Oh, I saw a news
Yeah.
story that you got killed in a bomb. And it's like, well, I'm still here. Okay, so then essentially the data on the internet loses its truth value. And therefore, we no longer have to be encumbered by it, and we're free from it. And this is like kind of the irony of you create so much data that the data becomes meaningless, as meaningless as a dream. Um, Now, that we're in the kind of a transitional stage where that's still not true. I mean, people go online, they get their news. But at some
Yeah.
point, that will no longer be possible in the same way that it is today. We're either going to have to recreate a literal, like, Catholic Church cathedral system where it's like, this is the approved news website, and you go to this to get the truth, and you ignore everything else, or we ban everything else. Or people are just going to say, like, I can't, and the like the Schrodinger uncertainty as we approach
Yeah.
this singularity or this event horizon of, getting back to what is a more authoritarian worldview ultimately. As we approach that, there's kind of this schizophrenia where you see all these conspiracy theories. I hear new ones every day about the elites
Yes.
are lizard people eating babies and stuff, and that almost necessarily has to be the case, because as we accelerate toward that event horizon, toward that ultimate, like, there's going to have to be people who determine what is true and what is not true, and there's no other way around that because technology
Yeah.
makes it impossible to believe what your eyes see. As we approach that, it's like we're going to get there's like a resistance. It's an infinite force against an unmovable object, and as we approach that, it's like the conspiracy theories become more unmoored from reality. But there is a breaking point where when no one believes anything, then everyone will have to believe. I mean, that what I'm saying here doesn't make sense, but you get at
I
the
understand what
the
you mean.
paradox of
Yes.
what I'm getting to.
Yeah. No, I don't know if you follow Yakubian Ape on Substack at all. Great culture writer. He just wrote about the. I'm sure you've heard about that the 4chan conspiracy lately about, was it Roy J? The Have you followed this at all? Oh, this is exciting. You should look into this. So there was recently a 4chan conspiracy theory about this comedian Roy J, right? And the idea that someone posts on 4chan and says, like, just a picture of this guy Roy J, and says, there's a demon who's retroactively rewriting himself into the past, and it's this demon. right? And they have a picture of this comedian Roy J. And then there's this whole big, 4chan conspiracy about how suddenly, at the time that that post was made, there was nothing on the internet about this guy, and then suddenly all this stuff on the internet appears about him. Um, and the underlying, the implicit narrative is that it's because something is writing this person into the internet, right, that didn't exist before. You can even go to his Wikipedia, and there's like a big section on, oh, that's interesting, that section isn't there anymore. There was a section on his Wikipedia page about this whole thing, right? So in and of itself, that's a funny conspiracy theory, but we're not far off from the point when a rogue AI or someone who controls an AI could have it rewrite what's on the internet and make it look as if all of this data has been on the internet for years, for decades, right? And then at that point, when that's possible, suddenly we're left, as you said, with this in this position where, okay, how do we determine what's real? How do we understand what's real? And I spent a lot of time on Twitter this last week, which I haven't done for years, just kind of trying to see some stuff about Iran, Israel. And as you know, probably having been on Twitter, the amount of AI garbage that's come out about that is insane. But then you click on every single post, and right under it is, "Hey Grok, what is this? Hey Grok, is this true? Hey Grok, is this AI?" Right? And I think that the worst case scenario is that we don't, as you said, decide like, okay, this is the website that's true, or these are the people who tell us, whether this is true or not. The worst case scenario is that we outsource that to something like Grok or to Chat GPT. And as a society, we just fall into this position where we're like, yes, this LLM is going to tell me what's true. When of course the LLM is the thing that's inventing everything that's not true, right? And again, I don't have a solution for that, but that just seems like the worst case scenario for me.
Yeah, I think I don't see any other way than pure theocracy. Basically, is it's like Anderson Cooper said it, and therefore I believe it. But of course,
Yeah,
it can't be that in it's going to look different. But as we get toward that, I mean, people are going to say, "Yep." I mean, this is what they said was going to happen, and this is what's happening, and we get it's kind of when these events unfold, when these events happen throughout the world, I always think that um, history feels slower as it happens than it in retrospect. In retrospect, you look at it, it's like, wow, all this stuff was happening at the same time, and what an amazing time to be alive. I'm sure those people would have, just felt like, oh, history's whizzing past us. But, you even think about the Bolshevik Revolution, and you think about being in those committee meetings with social democrats and things, and they're discussing like, oh, should we have a constitutional monarchy? What about these Bolsheviks? What about the Mensheviks? What about the and they're talking about all these factions. And you think about sitting in those meetings at the time, and you I don't know if they had watches in Russia in 1917, but they're checking
yeah,
their watch piece or something. They're like, oh, this meeting, we're just droning on about these details, just in the same way people are browsing Twitter, and
yeah,
is this true, Grok? Grok, is this true? And they're browsing through that, and it's like, at the time, things are banal until there's material risk. It comes back to that
yeah,
question of material risk. And so we're living in this disembodied world where there's a war on the other side of the world. And until it comes to America, it's never going to be real. I mean, that is the ultimate decider of reality, is whether
for
you live
sure.
or die. So as long as we are insulated from death and violence, reality is going to continue to become stranger, weirder, more conspiratorial, and more authoritarian.
Yeah.
It's sort of this like Fauci 4chan dialectic where, the authorities get more dogmatic, and then, the denizens online get more schizophrenic. And,
Yeah,
eventually that becomes untenable, and eventually it does result in violence. And in terms of the time scale of that, I don't know what that is. And it couldn't even be a symbolic thing, right? And I think
yeah,
Christianity in many ways was addressing similar problems that the Romans were having. Of course, they didn't have the internet at the time, but they had cults and they
sure.
had conspiracy. I mean, you read about the conspiracies that they had. They thought the emperor was taking off his head and putting it in a closet and doing weird magic rituals. I mean, they had, and they were, doing incest, all these weird things.
Yeah.
So all of that
It
same
just
kind of conspiratorial mindset, I think that's just what humans do when
yeah.
authority breaks down, as they come up with these ideas. And ultimately, there
Yeah.
will be a kind of religious revolution that
Yeah.
addresses that problem.
It is interesting how little we've changed. That is, I think anyone who reads any kind of history is like, oh, yeah, we're the technology has changed, but we're essentially the same enlightened ape that was saying and doing dumb things 2,000, 4,000, 10,000 years ago, right? And just to add to what you were saying before about the banality of history, um, there's a great, I think, book by Slavoj Žižek about the event and how an event creates its own antecedents. I could be butchering this concept, but essentially, things that happen don't matter until an event happens that makes them matter, right? Like all of the weird going ons in the with the CIA and in the Middle East and a lot of those things did not matter until 9/11 happened, and then 9/11 gave them a meaning that they did not have when they were happening. If that makes sense, right? In the same way, you're talking about these Bolshevik, those meetings didn't matter until X, Y, and Z had to happen in the future to then charge them with historical meaning. Um, a lot of the things that are happening now, including the Trump bombing Iran, right? Like what we don't know what meaning that will have. It has a different meaning to us than it will have historically 10, 15, 20 years from now, when there's that future event that then charges it with its real meaning, or I could say charges it, or even unearths its real meaning at that time.
It's an interesting concept. Yeah, I wonder how many meetings could have had meaning, but they never had their event to create that. So it's almost
Oh,
like
yeah.
there is something Darwinian about thinking about all of the organisms which are now extinct, and we're just this tiny little branch on this great tree surrounded by a cemetery of all these dead species, and we're like that tiny 1% that we're still around. And that's kind of, yeah, that's how history works. Is there's really the history that we find significant. We look back and we think, oh yeah, all these heroes. It's like, well, there were a lot of lame people who didn't do anything. There were a lot of slaves too, and we don't
Yeah.
remember them. We only remember the heroes, and that's not something that you can. I mean, there's been an attempt. I think the novel, the Picaresque, is an attempt to like,
Yeah.
we're gonna turn it around. We're gonna go through the life of an ordinary person, and that's sort of a revolt against this process. And you can revolt against that, but it only works for so long until actually, eventually there is an event that occurs that wipes out all of those novels, all those stories, all of that culture, and what you're left with is the heroes. You're left with the Maos and the Lenins and the people who made things happen. So it is a terrifying, because it's an existential question of what does that mean for me as an individual? Am I going to get wiped out? And it's like, yeah, I mean, if you're literally not a hero,
Maybe.
then you will get wiped out. That's the only way. And
Yeah.
I mean, but there's also a kind of maybe a reincarnation or recurrence in the sense of, the hero archetype is something which repeats and rhymes. So it's not
Yeah.
that there are many different heroes, but there's sort of one hero that keeps instantiating. So maybe there's hope in that. But yeah, this has been a very strange conversation, but I
It is.
enjoyed
And
it.
we went long too. I just saw what the time was. I'm sorry. We went a little long.
No,
I
that's
hope whoever
okay.
was waiting next isn't too mad.
No, that's okay. It was a good conversation. People can check you out. Diogenes of Orem will link that and in your articles if they want to get deeper into this. But yeah, I appreciate the introduction and you coming on.
Yeah. No. Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. If any parting words or things you want to plug besides the blog.
No, that's it. Go read it, subscribe or unsubscribe. I'm just happy to be on there plugging away. It's fun.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Diogenes.
Yeah.
Hope to talk to you again soon.
Yes. Thank you.
Take care. Bye bye.